Okay, I'll get started with a quick disclaimer while everybody comes trickling in. So first, welcome everyone. Today we have Doron, and the disclaimer is that all opinions expressed today are solely speakers' own personal opinions, not financial advice, and do not reflect the opinion of INSEAD, nor INSEAD's Healthcare Club and the Investment Management Club. No comments should be interpreted as an attempt to solicit investments for Sanvia Capital, which is reserved for institutional investors. Okay, great. So today's speaker is Doron Junger, our very own 99D alumnus with an MBA, and he is a medical doctor and someone who's worked at the world's 3 largest hedge funds, Citadel, SAC/Point72, and Millennium Partners. Today, Doron leads his own life sciences fund, Sanvia Capital, based in Miami, and luckily we've got 1 hour with him. Do send your questions in the chat. We have teammates who will be prioritizing them, so let's get to it. Doron, you've done a lot, right? You're a doctor, you're a hedge fund manager now, you're at INSEAD. Very quickly, where are you from and what was your academic and career path?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I really hope my wife and kids are listening, just so they know how proud and in awe of me they ought to be, which I periodically remind them of, so far to no avail whatsoever. But kidding aside, I'd really like to warmly thank Liz, Idan, and Zach for conceiving of and inviting me to do this webinar, and would especially like to thank Kenny, who deserves the single most credit for making this event happen, and who continues to impress me with his initiative and at every step of the way of us getting to know each other over the past 6 months or so. So with that, hello everyone. My name is Doron Junger, as Kenny said. I'm a German-born December '99 INSEAD MBA alumnus, a father of 3, a hedge fund manager focused on long-short equity investments and public companies in the biopharma sector, and a surgeon by background. I live in Miami, where my firm Sanvia Capital is based. At the core of my career is being a doctor. I have a younger brother who was born with medical complications, which as a young child I could only process emotionally, but which I nevertheless credit with my single-minded desire as far back as I can remember to become a surgeon. Of course, as a boy growing up in Germany, I fantasized about becoming a footballer, and during the Boris Becker years, a tennis player. And embarrassingly, when a French pianist named Richard Kleiderman became a household name in Germany, I briefly dreamed of becoming a pianist. But I soon realized that while I could be a surgeon who played piano as a hobby, which I still do, I couldn't be a pianist who operates on people for fun in his spare time. That's generally frowned upon. I grew up in Frankfurt am Main, the son of immigrants, and the first in my family to attend university, and studied medicine at Oxford, where I also managed the student newspaper, my very first business experience. My parents and paternal grandparents were in business, and much of our regular dinner conversation was about business. Growing up, I just didn't think I had much aptitude for business. But managing that student newspaper at Oxford, which I originally applied to do only to impress a girl, I realized that managing a P&L actually came to me pretty naturally. After graduating from Oxford Medical School, I pursued my surgical training in London with stints in New York and at Harvard, which led to me passing my US medical boards in the US, and then at the end of my general surgical training, becoming a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of London. At which point I discovered a secret that if you are intellectually curious and averse to boredom and like to keep mentally challenging yourself, training to become a surgeon is very stimulating and satisfying. But the day-to-day existence of a consultant surgeon, not so much, especially not given the emerging trend at the time of my training, which has only grown since, of intense specialization. As a surgeon, you come to know more and more about less and less. If you take that to its logical extreme, to its reductionist absurdum, you come to know everything about nothing. And intellectually, that didn't seem at all appealing to me. We had on the plastic and reconstructive surgery service in London that I was part of, a surgeon who was widely admired for his technique and did nothing but breast reductions by one particular method. If he was any more specialized, he'd be doing only right breasts or left breasts. In contrast, in my role as a biopharma investor, I feel blessed to have the opportunity to diligence companies in a broad range of medical specialties, from ophthalmology and neurology to psychiatry and cancer, and a broad range of technologies, from gene and cell therapies to antibody drug conjugates and traditional small molecule chemistry. In addition, as someone who gets energized by other people, I'm an E on the Myers-Briggs, especially when they're intellectually gifted and keenly motivated and have deep subject area expertise as the C-suite of the companies in our universe that I experience it as a perk of my role to get to know and learn from key opinion leaders, all as part of our investment process. And we invest globally so that we look for opportunities all over the world. We've invested in companies in the US, the UK, Germany, Switzerland, France, Holland, Denmark, and Israel. How I went from being a doctor treating patients in Harley Street in London one week to working at a hedge fund the next is a story of happenstance rather than design. Although INSEAD played a major role in it, as was much the rest of my career in finance.
Great, thanks. We have actually a few doctors in this chat right now in the healthcare club, so they're listening very avidly, including Zach here. And just for those that aren't familiar with the investment world, some MBAs here, could you quickly walk us through what Sanvia Capital does at a high level, please?
Sure. I am the founder and portfolio manager of Sanvia Capital. Sanvia is a deeply fundamental, long-short biopharmaceutical fund focused on highly innovative small and mid-cap public companies in the biotech and the pharmaceutical sectors. At the core of Sanvia is the credo that economic value is unlocked where patient value is created, where drug development companies toil to meaningfully improve the quality of life or extend the longevity of patients. We apply our scientific and clinical knowledge to identify inefficiently valued, overlooked, or misunderstood companies at the frontier of value transformation and select single-name idiosyncratic shorts. Our mission is to sustainably achieve for risk-tolerant, opportunity-seeking investors long-term capital appreciation with liquidity through dynamic absolute returns in the biopharmaceutical sector, while adhering to Sanvia's principles of integrity, excellence, and discipline. Let me know if I should go over any of this word salad to make it more intelligible to anyone less familiar with, say, long-short investing.
Yeah, no, that would be great. I think we have a couple of healthcare questions to throw at you first. And then for those interested in investing in portfolio management, we can come to some of those questions after, if that works for you.
Sure.
So I think we have a mix of people with us here today. So some from the healthcare club and some from the investment management club. So definitely we'll need definitions on both sides of the board for us. So our first question is more on the healthcare side. Again, kind of keeping in mind that there's quite a few people here who are new to healthcare and who Kenny and I are trying to convince that it's an exciting space. So as a trained surgeon and now on the biotech investment side, what excites you most about working in healthcare right now?
Well, personally, as a healthcare investor, I see my role as an extension of my enduring fascination with medicine and science. And I suspect that speaks to at least some of you too. It's that fascination that drove me to train as a doctor in the first place and become a surgeon. Being introduced to novel approaches to ameliorating and sometimes curing human disease and suffering, and being introduced to the people behind those innovations, becoming financially invested in these endeavors and tracking their development and ultimately seeing them succeed as therapies being prescribed by doctors and benefiting patients, that just doesn't get old in my eyes. I see myself doing this until I can't anymore. And I feel that I've landed on professionally doing something that I'd want to continue, even if I won the lottery. I hope you all find something that speaks to you in similar ways too. Now, I suppose it's always been a great time to be a healthcare investor because in addition to perpetually riding the wave of therapeutic innovation, it gives you an opportunity to do well as you are doing good. But the advent of the Human Genome Project ushered in an especially exciting time in biopharma innovation, a golden age of biotech, if you will. Whereas in the past, we were mostly tapping in the dark and making educated guesses about which drugs might work and why. We now understand the genetic basis for human disease in a way that we didn't before. And that understanding has allowed us to develop drugs in a much more rational way. At the same time, therapeutic modalities, that is, novel pharmacologic technologies that would have seemed futuristic only a short while ago, are part of our existing reality, or very soon will be. There are a handful of approved gene therapies, for example, all of which use viruses to deliver strands of DNA to cells with mutated genes to allow those cells to make intact versions of the protein that is missing in these patients. There are several approved cell therapies consisting of live cells harvested from affected patients, genetically altered, then greatly amplified in number and reinfused or even created as off-the-shelf products to treat cancers. There are chemotherapies that are highly toxic to cancer cells and are chemically joined to an antibody that targets these cancer cells wherever in the body it finds them, like a heat-seeking missile, and releases its payload only once inside the cancer cell. Last week, it was announced that the US Food and Drug Administration will be rendering an approval decision before the year is up on the first gene editing therapy, which uses CRISPR technology to rewrite the faulty genetic code of the red blood cell precursors in patients with sickle cell anemia. I could go on, but I hope you get the sense of how exciting it is to me that the armamentarium available to biopharma drug developers today is vastly more sophisticated than the simple chemistry practiced exclusively by storied pharmaceutical companies when that was all there was available to them. Meanwhile, innovation continues within that dimension as well. And we have in our portfolio several companies that develop drugs based on good old-fashioned small molecule chemistry. Another exciting development in the sector within the last 20 years is the emergence of drug development programs and entire companies dedicated to treating rare diseases, of which there are many. Now, not all rare diseases are created equally, and some have a prevalence of about 1 in a million, which makes it exceedingly difficult to run a business, no matter how impactful the drug, and others are just not all that severe. But when there is a confluence of a relatively common rare disease from which patients suffer greatly and a treatment approach that promises a profound benefit or even a functional cure, companies like Genzyme, Alexion, Avexis, and others have proven just how successful they can be.
Great, thank you. Just a quick follow-up here. So penicillin was a game changer, and we've often heard that we're currently in the penicillin moment for cancer. Do you agree with this statement? And are we at an inflection point for other broad indications or diseases that you see?
What I'm excited about is a world in which human suffering from disease and the years of life lost from it are reduced as a result of innovative drug development. The various treatment modalities I mentioned above, gene and cell therapy, gene editing, and small molecule chemistry, all hold great promise in turning this vision into reality. I'm hopeful as ever about the emergence of better treatments for cancer. But I'm excited also to see the first treatment approved potentially next month to slow down the progression of Alzheimer's dementia, and more marked therapeutic effects in years to come as even better drugs emerge. I'm excited about the potential of psychedelic medicines in the treatment of patients with an array of mental health issues, from depression to anorexia and addiction. I'm looking forward to seeing the impact of treatments for metabolic diseases, including diabetes, obesity, and fatty liver that are the scourge of mankind, particularly wherever Western diets are consumed and people live longer. And I'm excited about success in treating rare diseases for which there are no good existing treatments, including for ALS, Friedreich's ataxia, epidermolysis bullosa, and Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Great, that's super helpful. And I think, we're talking a lot about AI in school, coming up on maybe having a policy about using ChatGPT for homework. But just wondering, this is a bit of a broad question, but how do you see the role of AI developing in healthcare and biotech over the next 5 to 10 years? Everything from sort of clinical decision support systems to how AI is being used to help develop some of the pharmaceuticals that you've been mentioning.
Well, we all know that predictions are notoriously difficult, especially about the future, as the saying goes, but I'll give it a go. I think AI will lead to improvements in several areas of drug development and in my part of the business of investing in the sector as well. AI could transform how molecules are designed and drugs are discovered. One of our portfolio companies, for example, uses augmented reality software to blow up a molecule to the size of a room and has its scientists walk under and inside the molecule as they consider its structure and the configuration of binding domains. Natural language processing is already being used to identify keywords and phrases used by public company executives on earnings calls. Phrases such as "to tell you the truth" and "honestly," which are usually cause for concern, to help guide investment decisions. I can see a huge role for AI in unifying electronic patient records. And I wonder whether AI will ultimately replace or partly replace research analysts and portfolio managers, as I suppose we all worry about our chosen fields being supplanted by AI.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful. And just as MBA students, if you had any advice or suggestions for us, what are the 1 or 2 areas that you think that we should keep a close eye on?
A few areas I would highlight are metabolic disease, because of its huge prevalence and growing incidence around the world, as affluence and the spread of the Western diet and sedentary lifestyles lead to more diabetes, more obesity, including childhood obesity and fatty liver. Psychedelics are emerging as a powerful tool in the treatment of an assortment of mental health conditions. And there is an opportunity to shape how these treatments are going to change the practice of psychiatry. And finally, as we just talked about, AI is an emerging tool in investment research and portfolio management. Asset management firms will pay good money for a scalable investment edge and have the budget to do so. At the time of the San Francisco gold rush, to strike it rich, it was a safer bet to sell shovels than by finding gold.
A quick follow-up on metabolic diseases. So Gurpreet, and also in this call right now, he sent a question ahead of time asking if you thought obesity would be the biggest epidemic of the late 21st century.
I think the combination of obesity, high cholesterol, fatty liver, and diabetes sets up the opportunity for a company or a group of companies to emerge as a juggernaut in terms of valuation, the likes of which we haven't seen before in healthcare.
And then just on the other side of the coin, I think you mentioned that some of the companies working towards rare diseases are working for very small populations. So just thinking about having access to some of these drugs and thinking about kind of a shift to value-based care, how do you see that aspect resolving itself? How do you see kind of a global widespread access to some of these drug developments that may be kind of quite expensive? And how do you see, I guess, payers getting good value out of that and ensuring that the drugs that are being developed are effective?
That goes back to something I was tangentially referring to before, and that is that in the rare disease category, when there's a confluence of disease that is very severe and a drug that emerges as a treatment to materially improve the quality of life or even the longevity, or in extreme cases offers a cure or functional cure for these patients, then even a high price can be justified as providing excellent value to payers, to patients, and to government reimbursement agencies for these payments. We have in our portfolio a company that I've talked publicly about before called Crystal Biosciences, which recently gained approval for the first time ever for a treatment for a devastating dermatological condition called epidermolysis bullosa, which thankfully is rare and results in painful blistering and the formation of open wounds and a cycle of healing, fibrosis, and wounding again in children who grow into teenagers and young adults, when this repetitive cycle of healing and injury eventually results in them forming many squamous cell carcinomas, from which they, in many cases, prematurely die. And for parents and other caregivers, taking care of these children is a massive undertaking. It's life-changing for the parents and of course for their children to receive this diagnosis. As part of our investment research, I joined a patient advocacy online group just to better understand how big the disease burden is, and it's massive. It costs the system hundreds of thousands of dollars in bandages and ointments alone to treat these kids over the course of the year. The gene therapy that Crystal has developed, although it will also cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, is nevertheless good value for money for these patients, especially if in the long term it can add years to their lives, because fewer of them will develop squamous cell carcinoma and prematurely die from it.
No, thanks for sharing that. And a quick follow-up again on another indication you had mentioned, our treatment method, psychedelics. And I know there's, for example, GH research with DMT from toads, potentially, different companies doing crazy experiments out there. Among all the indications, kind of what's your horse in the race as for the ones that would be most likely to be approved first, and the ones that you see that have the most promise?
In terms of what is likely to be approved first among psychedelics, we could just throw into the conversation Johnson & Johnson's Spravato, which is already approved and strictly not a ketamine, but hallucinogenic. Ketamine, as many of you know, has been used in the field of anesthetics for decades and decades. But the development of it as an antidepressant by Johnson & Johnson, focusing on the S enantiomer of ketamine, led to its successful approval. What was really novel and associated with it is the way that this drug is now being used in the treatment of depression, and that has brought with it the emergence of ketamine clinics to facilitate the administration of ketamine under guidance of a therapist. MAPS, a charitable group, is on the verge of submitting to the FDA, the US Food and Drug Administration, an application for ecstasy, essentially, for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. We have been invested in Compass Pathways, a company based in the UK and in the US, which is developing psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, as a treatment for an array of different mental health disorders, leading with treatment-resistant depression. And there have been a couple of studies supported by Compass with its unique crystalline formulation of psilocybin, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, including the largest ever placebo-controlled randomized study comparing 3 different doses of psilocybin, a placebo-like 1 milligram dose and more therapeutic 10 milligram and 25 milligram doses in patients who suffer from depression and have not been helped by conventional therapy. And then we have investment in our portfolio in a microcap company called Celos, which is developing the other enantiomer, the R enantiomer, in combination with the S enantiomer. So really the racemic mixture of ketamine, specifically for patients with depression, as well as suicidal behavior and ideation, in the hope that a dose of ketamine 24 hours or so after their admission to the emergency room and the psychiatric ward after a failed suicide attempt or the acute ideation about committing suicide will help these patients in a material way to emerge from that experience well enough and durably enough for conventional antidepressant therapy, which can take 6 weeks or so to kick in, to take effect, and be able to be released from hospital sooner than they currently can, which is usually after about a week.
No, I mean, I think these are great points. And we know lots of people around us, right, who've been affected by these different kinds of indications in the CNS space. So really hope that they clear those trials and come online.
Where I see the opportunity to be involved in the potential transformation of the way psychiatric treatment is delivered to patients as a result of the emergence of psychedelics is in figuring out how these treatments are best made available. Initially in the United States, where I expect that they are going to be approved first, but then really around the world. This is a very different paradigm from a psychiatrist writing a prescription for a 30 or 60-day supply of your favorite conventional SSRI antidepressant, and then asking the patient to come back some 6 weeks later to see what effects the treatment has had and how well they tolerate it. It's really a very different paradigm. Administering a psychedelic treatment with the presence of a educated and trained therapist there and then, and having a preparatory session beforehand and an integrating session afterwards. It creates a lot of opportunity. Obviously, it also creates a lot of challenges, as anything does anytime you disrupt a conventional established way of doing things, as the emergence of psychedelics promises to do to the treatment of psychiatry.
Thank you for that. We're at the half-hour mark, so shifting gears a little bit perfectly, or as we do have the other half here with a bunch of people interested in finance. Portfolio management, what is Sanvia's investment philosophy in a nutshell?
With us, our investments really start with this credo that I mentioned before. We look for companies that promise to unlock economic value where patient value is created. We look for the drug development companies that go to tremendous effort to meaningfully improve the quality of life or extend the longevity of patients suffering from disease. And then we apply our scientific and clinical knowledge to identify these companies, be they inefficiently valued or overlooked by other investors or misunderstood for a variety of reasons, as they are undergoing the process of value transformation. We are, generally speaking, long biased. We believe that there will be more value unlocked to the upside than the downside in a sector that is still emerging and focuses on innovation, as biopharma does. This is not a mature industry full of mature companies, and we are aware of the fact that, statistically speaking, more drug development projects will fail rather than succeed. And we're keen to the opportunity to select single name idiosyncratic shorts. We pride ourselves in adhering to our principles of integrity and excellence and discipline. And by discipline, I particularly mean balance, a balance between the opportunities, but also the risks that we see. Balance between being an avid supporter of a new scientific advance, but then contrasting that with valuation and the likelihood of success, the market opportunity, and so forth.
And a quick follow-up here is, for your average investor, if you look at a biotech stock or a selection of them, you can often see those that kind of explode in value and those that crater overnight. And generally people associate that biotech investing is extremely risky. What is it that draws you to this general industry of investing? And what do you love about it?
It's true that it is very volatile, but we embrace that volatility as an opportunity, as well as look at it as a scourge. It's an opportunity because sometimes there is significant movement in the value of a biotech stock for no good fundamental reason. And when we look ahead, we see that kind of dislocation in value as an opportunity to add to a stock in which we have a position or to enter a position. On the other hand, we look at the risk that you mentioned, which to an outsider might appear as no better than a coin flip chance of predicting the outcome of a clinical study, the outcome of FDA advisory committee meeting or an FDA approval decision, as the kind of event with significant underlying uncertainty that we can use our fundamental backgrounds as scientists or as clinicians, as investors with experience of precedent decisions and precedent studies to refine those odds in a meaningful way and establish an edge. We recognize that we're going to be wrong in our predictions on many occasions, but as long as we can be correct a majority of times, or at least structure what we stand to lose in any one of these events, as opposed to what we stand to gain in a way that favors our odds, then we can be over time tremendously successful for ourselves and for the investors that allocate capital to our fund.
No, thank you. That's very fascinating. And the follow-up to that is, since the pandemic, we've had a whole host of biotechs come online, IPO. A lot of them have barely made it past their preclinical or phase 1. And with all these companies now listed, is this a problem? And 2, how do you sift through it? And 3, how does one even begin to evaluate what a good or bad idea is in these drug development space? practices?
It is a problem to some extent, but as is the case with most problems, it's also an opportunity. A problem for a couple of reasons. First of all, several of these companies probably should not have had the opportunity to access the public capital markets in the first place. That may have been premature for many of them and created a false sense that these companies were de-risked and further along in the path of their clinical development than they actually were. There's a tremendous leap that a company undergoes in terms of how much clinical risk it has behind it as opposed to in front of it, as it makes a transition from a preclinical to a clinical company. When I started in my career as an investor some 20 years ago, it was a real rarity to see a company become public that had not yet treated a single human being. And that became not a rarity anymore in the years between 2018 and the immediate post-COVID era. This dynamic allowed preclinical companies to access capital markets and go public when it's clear in retrospect that they probably would have been better off continuing to develop in private and generating more data before making the leap onto a public exchange. It created a problem also in as much as that there was a tremendous expansion in the number of publicly traded biopharmaceutical companies. And there hasn't been a similar expansion in the number of trained and experienced investment analysts and portfolio managers focused on our sector. So that for a while, there has been, and I think continues to be, some indigestion difficulties among our peers, ourselves included, in understanding all of these public companies and the risks and opportunities that come along with them. There was an age when any 3 or 4 of my peers and I could get together and chat about their favorite investments and my favorite investments, and we could have a really constructive discussion. Nowadays, it's much rarer because they're selecting their favorite long and shorts from a much, much bigger pool. And the likelihood that any one of us will have an informed opinion about their set of favorite long and short investments, it's lower than used to be the case. But that's also where I think this expansion in the number of publicly traded biopharma companies creates an opportunity, because there are nowadays fewer really well followed, well understood, and appropriately priced companies than there were. And saying that the other way around, there's a greater number of misunderstood, inefficiently priced, and overlooked companies that the likes of me and my colleagues can now find.
And I think just a quick follow-up to that, because we have quite a few questions from the Investment Management Club coming through on your fund. So you mentioned before that you really kind of relish having the opportunity to speak to founders who have really, really in-depth knowledge about the subject matter that they're working on. So just in terms of investment philosophy, what do you look at in the companies you invest in terms of the founders' skills, management experience versus sort of scientific knowledge and experience? What do you prioritize? How do you balance that?
10 years ago, when I applied for a visa to continue to work and live in the United States, the US government attested me outstanding ability in my field of investing in public biopharmaceutical companies. But I'm clear about this. The real heroes are the founders and managers of the companies that we invest in our sectors. we as investors, we take a portfolio approach, and while we endeavor to add value in the limited ways that we can, whether through capital or introductions and strategic suggestions, we are largely along for the ride. It is a privilege of my work to have access to some of the most successful people in drug development and to feel like I'm the least smart person in the room when I meet with them face to face. What we look for are people who are similarly impassioned about the businesses that they start and manage, have really deep domain expertise, have a very good understanding of the risks that they face, and a clear strategy for navigating around those, have an excellent overview of the competitive landscape, a rich network to work with the best professions in the various functions their company requires, and who are not wedded to any one strategy, any one asset, or any one path for their company. In other words, executives who are nimble. Biopharma is a sector that's rife with companies that have had to adapt or die. And the successful companies in our business have, in many cases, had to adapt through several iterations. You think about Vertex, for example, as a company that started out one way, which didn't work, reinvented itself, had some limited success, and then reinvented itself again and had tremendous success. There are too many companies that fall by the wayside because they become wedded to a particular technology or asset or a trajectory that they keep in mind for themselves and are averse to letting a larger company better placed to take over the development of its drugs or the marketing of its drugs out of a preference by the management or the board to go it alone, which sometimes does not optimize shareholder value. We, in contrast, we look for those management teams supported by those boards that understand that there may be an optimal time to pass the baton on to a larger company that can extend the reach and can extend the value of a medicine the originators have worked hard to bring to the market, and that larger company is willing to recognize that value in a large acquisition premium.
Thanks. And you've mentioned the word biopharma a few times, and maybe should have asked this earlier, and I think you do a better job explaining it. What is the difference between biotech and biopharma?
I think this is mainly a historical distinction, which in practice nowadays is very much blurred. A pharmaceutical company in the past, by which I mean, say, 20 or so years ago, was a company with an array of different small molecule medicines that originated through traditional chemistry and developed those products and marketed them in many markets around the world. In contrast, a biotech company back then developed its treatments in biologic systems, usually in bacteria, and focused on antibody therapies or early RNA or RNAi therapies. But over time, many pharmaceutical companies have developed the capabilities to play in both areas and very successfully. And traditional biotech companies have matured to focus on more than one asset in many commercial markets around the world, and add to their armamentarium some small molecule drugs when those assets had promise that equaled the biologics. So I use the term biopharma to encompass both, because it doesn't really make sense to me anymore in the year 2023 to drive a hard distinction between these companies. At the US FDA, drugs and biologics are still regulated and evaluated by different divisions, but there's a lot of crosstalk between these divisions, and they are subject to more similarities than they are differences. And I focus on all of those companies, in contrast to, for example, medical devices or investigative tests, which are evaluated under different premises by different regulators within the FDA, with different rules that I'm much less familiar with and don't focus on in our fund.
So just shifting back to the investment side a little bit, we have a couple of questions that have come in from our diligent audience. I might give you a couple of them at the same time, if that's okay. So the first one is, as a second market hedge fund, how do you help the company bring projects and pipelines forward? And then the second one is just to learn a little bit more about your fund. So I know you mentioned a bit about it at the beginning, but we have some curious people who are interested in your assets under management, historic performance, and your fund vehicle structure.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So to be clear, we recognize that our role as investors really is very secondary to the innovators, the scientists, the originators that work tirelessly to bring new medicines to the market. Like I said earlier, we are largely along for the ride. We develop a portfolio approach and don't stake our careers on furthering one particular drug development asset, as many scientists do. And there are a minority who succeed and a majority just as smart and motivated and hardworking that for whatever reason pursue a development that doesn't ever make it into the clinic, let alone become an approved drug. We have, as public company investors, the advantage of already dealing with the crème de la crème, so to speak, of companies that self-select by making it onto the public markets. The role that we can play in helping those companies is manifold. By supporting their share price as long investors, we play some role in facilitating the hiring of the best talent in the industry to those companies. We make it easier for them to craft partnerships and licensing deals, and ultimately for their value to be fully recognized by a larger company that acquires them at a premium. We can make suggestions, but that's ultimately all they are. We in our fund are not activist investors of the likes of Carl Icahn, who sometimes operates in our sector, or dedicated healthcare activists, of which there are a couple. We're not company originators. We're loath to take positions on the board of our companies because that generally really restricts our freedom to add and reduce to and from the positions that we hold. But we have good access and pride ourselves in excellent relationships with the C-suite of the companies that we invest in and those companies that we diligence. And we hope that we establish ourselves as smart investors who ask good questions and make good suggestions. And when the opportunity arises, to be helpful through making, say, personal introductions to other investors or other talent that we know from other portfolio companies, to be accretive to the managerial efforts of the executives in our companies. And then for more information on Sanvia and our structure and AUM, can I suggest that you follow up with me offline? We don't publicly comment on our AUM. We started our fund, and this might be interesting for some of you to know. We started our fund really independent of any of the large hedge funds, the large institutions that I worked at before. We went our own way with family and friends, investors who believed in us, and we will eternally be grateful for their support. We appropriately, I think, invested by far the majority of our liquid net worth into the fund. I think that's what investors like to see, that you have a lot of skin in the game, that you believe in your success and that you take the kind of risk that you are asking for them, and then some. And we have since added an institutional mandate to our AUM, and that really sets us now on a track to grow the fund significantly from additional institutional investments.
Wonderful. Yeah, it must be very, big leap of faith to just pour your own money into the fund, but I'm sure that's kind of walking the talk. Question from Idan earlier, which was biotechs, they fundamentally bleed cash. We're in a rising interest rate environment. Has your fund's investing strategy changed in the past few years?
Yeah, good question, Idan. It's had to change, and we see the impact of a rising rate environment on the index that is most representative of the biotech universe that we invest in. That's the XBI, the S&P 500 Biotech Index, which really went on a nosedive sometime after February 2021, and that accelerated. And from peak to trough, the sector lost about 70% of its value within a pretty short time. And it has recovered some, but has about 100% left to go before it reaches its February 2021 level. And that's in some part because of the things that we all learned or are learning at INSEAD, from the CAPM and the discount rate that we apply. And that's especially important for companies, like Idan says, that perennially consume cash from investors or from partnerships while their drug assets are undergoing development and before they become commercial assets. It's less true, of course, of those companies that are already profitable, but sometimes rising tide lifts all boats, and the opposite is also true. And just about all companies in our sector got pressured to lesser or various degrees. So we shifted and adapted with that and looked for companies that had long cash runways that either were commercial or were nearing commercial stage. We looked for companies among those that are still at developmental stage with important catalysts to occur well before they were due to run out of cash. And we avoided, on the other hand, those companies that had short cash runways we're valued at a highly positive enterprise value, which is market cap less net cash, and that we're bereft of catalysts with the potential to occur before they ran out of cash. And that was a successful strategy. Our short book was meaningfully up during that period. Our long book suffered, but altogether we suffered a great deal less and did a better job at preserving our investors' capital than the performance of the XBI would suggest.
Great. And just conscious of your time, we have one last question for you before I'll hand back over to Kenny to wrap up. You've had sort of 20 years to think back on your experience at INSEAD and everything that you learned and all the people that you met here. What was the true value of coming to INSEAD? And how has it helped you throughout your career at different stages?
I think of my career in three chapters: a pre-INSEAD chapter, a short chapter comprising of the few years immediately post-INSEAD, and then the ongoing chapter of my investing career. And just from the way that I structured that thought, I hope you can tell that I consider INSEAD to have been really pivotal to my career. The first chapter, the pre-INSEAD chapter, consisted of me being a surgeon. And I didn't come to INSEAD thinking that I would make a radical career change. Rather, I had immediately before coming to INSEAD applied to do some research. As is usually the case, when you do that, you apply for a grant. And that grant was approved, but with a delay of about a year. And as I asked around some of my mentors for suggestions of what I could usefully do with a year of my time, the most exciting thing that the younger, more modern, forward-thinking consultant surgeons that I admired suggested was doing an MBA. And where better to go than INSEAD if you have only a year? And I gravitated towards that suggestion rather than doing locum work or work as a surgeon in the third world, probably because of the interest that I had developed from my family and from the opportunity I had to manage the Oxford University student newspaper. I wasn't really prepared for what happened during my time at INSEAD, which was that the exposure to the students I met there and the subject matter I was learning excited me beyond any expectation I had about the potential I saw for combining my background and my passion for medicine with opportunities in finance and business. There was at my time at INSEAD a course in cyber entrepreneurship, and towards the end of that, all the students wrote a business plan for a cyber idea that they had. In my case, the year was 1999, and I wrote a business plan for an idea that I had that was similar to WebMD, if you like. And INSEAD had invited a jury to judge the presentations. And although I had no expectation of really even keeping up with many of the much more qualified and business experienced students in the course who had spent those 4 or 5 years that I'd spent as a training surgeon in management consulting, as strategists, or as investment bankers, I ended up winning that competition. And along with it came some venture funding from Vivendi, a French utilities company / VC, or V Ventures, the VC arm of Vivendi. And I turned that business plan into a company, and in that short chapter comprising of a few years immediately post INSEAD, I pursued that business plan, grew that business through 2 rounds of funding, attracted some 15 employees, and finally was able to, after a few years, sell the company to a larger competitor. The whole experience did not, unfortunately, make me rich, except in experience. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do after that, and that's when happenstance, which I referred to earlier, made an appearance. And through medical school, a colleague and friend of mine was introduced to a portfolio manager at Citadel, and that started the ongoing and 3rd chapter of my career, and that's my investing career. Last month, on May 19th, was the year anniversary of my starting at Citadel, and I literally went to work at Citadel's offices in London within a couple of weeks of seeing patients in Harley Street. So INSEAD, to sum it up, was really a game-changing, pivotal moment for me in the trajectory of my career.
Wow, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, and that's really also good advice, I think, for us all in terms of all the ground we've covered today, in terms of healthcare, investing, and kind of the value INSEAD brings. So thank you very much for your time today, Doron. It was a great hour with you.
You're so welcome, Kenny. It was a pleasure. I hope whether it's through LinkedIn or my email, which you can get from Kenny, any of you who have questions after this, won't hesitate to reach out. I'll look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for your time.